The mirror reflected a stranger. Pale face, red eyes, hands trembling like leaves in the wind. Isabella didn't recognize the woman staring back at her, the one who had lost everything in a single night. The torn dress still carried the perfume of the party, but now it seemed like a shroud. Behind her, footsteps echoed in the marble corridor. Slow, deliberate. He was coming. And this time, there would be nowhere to hide. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which town you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The rain had started 3 days before Isabella arrived at the manor, as if the sky knew something terrible was about to happen. The drops beat against the window panes with an almost human insistence, creating tears that streamed down the windows as if the house itself were weeping. She watched from the carriage, her fingers intertwined in her lap, her heart beating an irregular rhythm that seemed to echo the sound of hooves against the wet stones. The will had been clear. Isabella Montgomery, a 17-year-old orphan, would inherit a small fortune under one condition. She was to live at the Cavendish Manor until she came of age. The family that had taken her in after her parents, Death had accepted the proposal with an enthusiasm she hadn't understood at the time. Now, seeing the dark imposingness of the structure that rose among the trees like a sleeping creature, she began to understand the weight of the circumstances. The carriage stopped with a jolt that made her shoulder hit the side. The coachman, a man of few words and small eyes, dismounted to open her door. The air that entered was heavy with dampness and something else, a scent of withered roses and damp earth that made her stomach clench. Her feet touched the uneven stone ground, and she felt the rainwater seep through the thin soles of her shoes. The manor rose before her like a mountain of dark stone, its tall windows seeming like closed eyes, its pointed towers cutting the gray sky. There was something alive in that building, as if it breathed with the wind that whistled through the battlements. Isabella pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the cold she felt came from within, not from without. The main door opened before she could knock. A tall, thin woman appeared in the doorway, dressed in black from head to toe, as if in perpetual mourning. Her eyes were small and piercing, her mouth a thin line that had never known a smile. It was Mrs. Albright, the governess, about whom Isabella had heard whispers in the town, a woman who knew all the Cavendish family's secrets and guarded each of them like cursed treasures. Without a word of welcome, Mrs. Albright turned her back and walked down the corridors. Isabella followed her, her footsteps echoing on the cold marble, the walls covered with old portraits that seemed to watch her every move. The painted faces had something ghostly about them in the dim light filtering through the windows. Men with dark beards and stern gazes, women with translucent skin and enigmatic smiles, all dead for decades, but their eyes seemed too alive. The room assigned to her was on the second floor, in a wing that seemed little used. The floorboards groaned under her feet, and there was a smell of mold that no amount of perfume could disguise. The bed had a dark wooden canopy, carved with figures she couldn't distinguish in the gloom. A single window overlooked the back gardens, where the trees danced a melancholic dance in the rain. Mrs. Albright placed her small suitcase in the center of the room and turned to her for the first time. Her eyes were the color of wet slate, hard and cold as stone. Meals are served at 7 in the morning, noon, and 7 in the evening. We do not tolerate delays. The masters of the house do not like to be disturbed unnecessarily, so keep to your designated areas. The library and the main drawing room are off limits. Isabella nodded, though a part of her wanted to ask about the masters of the house. The will had only mentioned Lord Alistair Cavendish, a middle-aged man who rarely appeared in public. But there was something in the way Mrs. Albright spoke, in the plural, that suggested other presences in the manor. "Is there anyone else living here?" she asked, her voice sounding weaker than she intended. A strange smile touched the governess's lips, as if she knew a joke Isabella didn't understand. "Oh, yes, dear. There is always someone living here. The walls of this house are never empty." Before she could ask what that meant, Mrs. Albright left the room, closing the door with a click that sounded too definitive. Isabella was alone for the first time since she arrived, and the silence that enveloped her was different from any silence she had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a palpable presence, as if someone were breathing right beside her. She approached the window and looked out at the gardens. The rose bushes were stripped of flowers, their branches twisted like arthritic fingers. In the center of the garden was a marble fountain, with a statue of a woman holding an urn. Even through the rain, Isabella could see that the statue's face was turned directly toward her window, and for an absurd moment, she had the impression that the stone figure was watching her. The first night was restless. The wind made the house groan like a wounded animal, and there were sounds she couldn't identify. Footsteps that came from nowhere specific, doors closing by themselves, whispers that could just be the air passing through cracks. She pulled the blankets up to her chin and tried to convince herself that they were just the natural noises of an old house. But when the tower bell struck midnight, she heard something that made her sit up in bed with her heart pounding. Music. Piano. A melancholic melody that rose from the depths of the house like a lament. The music was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Played by hands that knew every note by heart, every pause laden with emotion. She got up and walked to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. The music seemed to come from afar, perhaps from the main drawing room that Mrs. Albright had declared off-limits. There was something hypnotic about that melody, as if each note were a call directed specifically to her. Against all good sense, she opened the door. The corridor was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint moonlight that entered through the tall windows. The music continued, clearer now, guiding her like an invisible thread. Her bare feet touched the cold marble as she walked toward the sound, each step taking her deeper into the sleeping house. The stairs creaked under her weight, but she didn't care. The music had become the only important thing in the world, filling the void in her chest that she had carried since her parents' death. It was as if someone were playing directly for her soul, knowing every wound, every unshed tear. The main drawing room revealed itself through half-open double doors. It was an imposing room, with crystal chandeliers that caught the moonlight and scattered it in silver fragments across the high ceiling. In the center, a black grand piano gleamed like a living creature. And playing it, he had his back to her. But even so, Isabella knew she had never seen anything like that man. His hair was dark as a starless night, wavy and touching the collar of a white shirt that seemed made of light. His shoulders were broad, his hands, she could see them dancing over the keys, were long and elegant, like those of an artist or an aristocrat. The music stopped abruptly. He turned, and Isabella felt her world disintegrate and rebuild in a single instant. His eyes were the color of the sea during a storm, green and gray and impossible to decipher. His face had the cruel perfection of fallen angels, with features that seemed sculpted from marble by an artist obsessed with beauty. There were thin scars on his face, as if someone had tried to destroy that perfection and failed, leaving only marks that made him even more fascinating. But it was his eyes that paralyzed her. They examined her as if they could see through her skin, through her bones, directly into her soul. There was knowledge there, knowledge of pains she had suffered, of fears she hid, of desires she didn't even understand. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice like dark velvet over steel. It wasn't a reprimand, but a statement. As if he knew exactly why she had come down and didn't blame her for it. Isabella opened her mouth to apologize, to explain about the music and how she couldn't resist. But no sound came out. It was as if he had stolen her voice with that look, leaving her mute and vulnerable before him. He rose from the piano bench, and she realized he was even taller than she had imagined. When he moved, it was with a fluid grace that brought to mind elegant predators, creatures that killed without losing their composure. Each step toward her made her heart beat faster, as if her body knew of some danger her mind had not yet comprehended. "Isabella Montgomery," he said, and to hear her name on his lips was like hearing a profane prayer. The little orphan, who inherited more than she deserved. There was something cruel in the way he said it, but also a genuine curiosity, as if she were a puzzle he wanted to solve. She finally found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. "Who are you?" A smile touched the corners of his mouth, but didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile that promised secrets and dangers, pleasures and pains in equal measure. I am Gabriel Cavendish, and this, he gestured around the drawing room with an easy elegance, is my home. You are here by my generosity, little Isabella. It would be wise to remember that. Gabriel Cavendish. The name had not been mentioned in the will, but now she remembered whispers she had heard in the town. Lord Alistair's youngest son, who had disappeared from society years ago after some scandal. Some said he had gone mad, others that he had died in a duel. But there he was, alive and all too real, looking at her as if she were simultaneously the most interesting and most dangerous thing he had ever encountered. I didn't know, she began, but he raised a hand, silencing her. Didn't know what? That I existed? That this house holds more secrets than your little heart can bear? That you were brought here for reasons far beyond a simple inheritance? His words sent a shiver down her spine. There was a veiled threat there, but also a promise. His eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel naked, as if all her defenses had been stripped away with a single glance. Why are you telling me this? She asked, surprising herself with her own courage. Gabriel took another step closer, and she could feel the warmth of his body, the masculine scent emanating from his skin. Wood, spices, and something darker she couldn't identify. When he spoke, his voice was low, intimate, as if he were sharing the world's most precious secret. Because you came to me, because you heard my music through the walls and the prohibitions, and your feet brought you here as if guided by something greater than your will. That tells me things about you, Isabella Montgomery, things that interest me immensely. He reached out and touched her face, just a brush of fingers against her skin, but it was as if lightning had passed through her. Her eyes closed involuntarily, and she leaned into the touch like a flower leans toward the sun. So young, he murmured, and there was something that sounded almost like sadness in his voice. So innocent. You have no idea what's coming, do you? Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor. Gabriel moved away from her immediately, his expression transforming into something cold and distant. Mrs. Albright appeared at the entrance of the drawing room, her face contorted in an expression of fierce disapproval. Miss Montgomery, she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. I believe I was very clear about the areas that are off limits to you. Isabella felt her face burn with shame and fear. She had broken the rules on the first night, had been caught in a situation she couldn't explain even to herself. But when she looked at Gabriel, perhaps seeking some word of defense, she found only that enigmatic smile that revealed nothing. Mrs. Albright is right, he said, his voice now formal and distant. Well, Miss Montgomery should be in her quarters. The night is no place for young maidens to walk alone. The change in his tone was like a slap. Moments before, he had spoken to her as if they were equals, as if there were something special between them. Now, he treated her like a child who had gotten lost where she shouldn't be. Mrs. Albright approached and grasped her arm with unnecessary force, her nails digging through the thin fabric of her nightgown. Wit, come, she said, pulling Isabella toward the door, and pray that Lord Alistair does not learn of this transgression. As she was dragged out of the drawing room, Isabella looked over her shoulder. Gabriel had returned to the piano, but he wasn't playing. Just sitting there, watching her leave with an expression she couldn't decipher. His eyes met hers for one last moment, and he inclined his head in an almost imperceptible salute, as if sealing some kind of silent agreement between them. Back in her room, Mrs. Albright pushed her inside and closed the door forcefully. Never again, she hissed through the wood. If I find you outside your quarters again during the night, there will be consequences you cannot imagine. Isabella leaned against the door, her heart still beating erratically. She could feel the echo of Gabriel's touch on her face, the memory of his eyes burning through her. There was something between them. She was sure of it, something Mrs. Albright feared enough to threaten her. She walked to the window and looked out at the gardens plunged into darkness. The statue of the woman with the urn was still there, her marble face turned upwards, and for an irrational moment, Isabella was certain that the statue was smiling. The days that followed fell upon her like a gray mist. Mrs. Albright had doubled her vigilance, appearing in corridors when Isabella least expected it, watching her every move with those slate eyes that never seemed to blink. Meals were served in a small parlor adjacent to the kitchen, far from the main drawing room where she had met Gabriel. But he was always present, even when she couldn't see him. She heard his footsteps in the corridors above, the sound of doors closing somewhere in the house, fragments of conversations in low tones that reached her like echoes from another world. Sometimes, very late at night, the music returned. Not the piano this time, but a violin that wept melodies that made her heart ache with longing for something she couldn't name. During the day, she wandered through the few rooms she was allowed, like a ghost in her own life. The smaller library, adjacent to her room, was filled with old books with yellowed pages that exuded the smell of vanilla and decay. She read to pass the time, but the words slipped through her mind without leaving a trace. Her thoughts always returned to that encounter in the drawing room, to the way Gabriel had touched her face, to the words he had said about her having been brought there for reasons beyond a simple inheritance. On the third morning, while silently eating breakfast, she heard voices coming from the main drawing room. One of them she recognized immediately, Gabriel's velvet and steel voice. The other was older, rougher, laden with an authority that tolerated no questioning. "She is too young," the older voice was saying, "and you know very well what kind of problems that can bring." "Father," Gabriel's voice carried forced patience, "she is here by right. The will was clear. The will was a folly of your uncle, and you know it. That man was always obsessed with romantic ideas about destiny and predestined connections." Isabella leaned closer to the door, her heart beating so hard she feared they could hear it. They were talking about her, about the will that had brought her there. "Perhaps," Gabriel said, and there was something dangerous in his voice now. "But she is here, and I intend to find out if my uncle's theories had any basis." "Gabriel," his father's voice carried a warning. "Father, I have spent years in this house, years observing, waiting. If there is a chance, however small, that she is what we are looking for, then it is worth investigating." The silence that followed was tense, laden with meanings Isabella didn't understand. Looking for? What were they looking for? And what had her uncle— she didn't even know she had an uncle— written in the will about her? "Be careful," the older voice finally said. "There is much at stake here, and if you are wrong about her, if she is just an ordinary girl, then we will deal with that when the time comes." Footsteps moved away, and Isabella recoiled from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. There were secrets here, secrets that involved her presence, her inheritance, perhaps even her own identity. She was part of some kind of experiment or test, something Gabriel and his father were conducting for reasons she couldn't imagine. But why her? What was so special about a 17-year-old orphan that could interest a powerful family like the Cavendishes? That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, watching shadows dance on the ceiling, trying to make sense of what she had heard. The moon was full, bathing the room in a silvery light that transformed everything into something ethereal and unreal. When the bells struck 2 in the morning, she made a decision. She needed answers. This time, she didn't leave her room on impulse or by the allure of music. She left with purpose, determined to discover the truth about why she was there. She descended the stairs more carefully, avoiding the boards she knew creaked, staying in the shadows whenever possible. The main drawing room was empty, but the library doors were ajar, leaking a golden light into the corridor. She approached silently and peered through the crack. Gabriel was there, but he wasn't alone. Lord Alistair, a tall, imposing man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much, stood before a bookshelf, leafing through a thick, leather-bound book. Gabriel paced back and forth like a caged animal, his hands clasped behind his back. "The signs are all there," Gabriel was saying. "The music drew her, exactly as the book predicts. She came to me without hesitation, without fear. Or she is simply a curious young woman who heard a piano in the middle of the night," Lord Alistair retorted. "We cannot base our hopes on coincidences." "Father, you didn't see her. You didn't feel what I felt when I touched her. There was something there, a connection that—" Lord Alistair closed the book sharply, the sound echoing through the library like a gunshot. Be careful, Gabriel. Your mother also believed in connections, in predestined fates, and look where that led her. A heavy silence fell upon the two men. Gabriel stopped walking, his shoulders tense. My mother died because she didn't fully understand what she was trying to do. I will not make the same mistakes. And what if you are wrong? If the girl is just normal? Gabriel turned to his father, and even in profile, Isabella could see the fierce determination on his face. Then she will die like all the others. The words hit Isabella like a punch to the stomach. She recoiled from the door, her hand covering her mouth to stifle the scream that wanted to escape. All the others. How many other girls had been brought to that house? How many had died? She ran back to her room, Gabriel's words echoing in her mind like a nightmare. There was something terrible happening in that house. Something that involved tests and experiments with young girls. And she was next. But as she lay in bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin, a part of her refused to accept what she had heard. There was something in the way Gabriel had spoken to her, in the way he had touched her face, that contradicted the coldness of his words. It was as if there were two different men, the one who had spoken tenderly of her youth and innocence, and the one who had spoken of death with such indifference. Which of the two was real? And more importantly, which of the two would determine her fate? Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of statues that wept marble tears and music that played in empty halls where shadows danced alone. And through it all, gray-green eyes that watched her with an intensity that made her heart ache in ways she didn't understand. The next morning, a change had occurred in the house's dynamic. Mrs. Albright was more severe than usual, her lips an even thinner line, her eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction that made Isabella shudder. During breakfast, the governess stood beside the table, watching Isabella's every move like a vulture waiting for carrion. "Lord Alistair would like to see you in his study after luncheon," she announced without preamble. Isabella almost choked on the bread she was eating. "May I ask why?" The smile Mrs. Albright gave her was like a blade wrapped in silk. "There are certain formalities that need to be discussed regarding your stay here, certain expectations that must be clarified." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of anxiety. Isabella tried to distract herself by looking at the gardens, where the rain continued to fall, but nothing could calm the growing terror in her chest. Gabriel's words from the night before echoed in her mind, "Then she will die like all the others." Lord Alistair's study was on the first floor, in a wing of the house she had never visited. Mrs. Albright escorted her there in silence, her footsteps echoing in the corridors like a funeral march. The door was of dark oak, carved with coats of arms she didn't recognize. "Come in," a voice from inside said when Mrs. Albright knocked. The study was a sanctuary of masculinity and power. The walls were covered with books from floor to ceiling, leather-bound volumes that seemed too ancient to be touched by mortal hands. A fireplace crackled on one wall, casting dancing shadows over the dark wooden furniture. Lord Alistair sat behind an immense desk, his pale hands clasped over a stack of documents. He was exactly as she had imagined, imposing even while seated, with a face that had been handsome in youth, but was now marked by the lines of time and, perhaps, by secrets that had taken their toll. His eyes were the same color as Gabriel's, but where the sun's burned with passion and mystery, the father's were cold as ice. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair before the desk. Isabella obeyed, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. Lord Alistair studied her in silence for a long moment, as if cataloguing every feature of her face, every breath she took. "You are very much like her," he finally said, his voice laden with something that could have been nostalgia or bitterness. "Like whom?" Isabella asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Your mother." She also had that same combination of fragility and strength. That same way of looking at the world as if she were seeing things others couldn't see. Isabella leaned forward, her heart pounding. "You knew my mother?" A smile touched Lord Alistair's lips, but there was no warmth in it. "I knew your mother, yes. In fact, it was through her that I learned about you. She told me about the child she carried, about the special gifts that child might have inherited. Gifts? The word came out as a whisper. Lord Alistair stood and walked to one of the bookshelves. He took out a book, the same one Isabella had seen the night before, and placed it open on the desk before her. The pages were covered with strange symbols, diagrams that seemed like maps of something not of this world, and text in a language she didn't recognize. Your family, my dear, carries a very special lineage, a lineage that dates back centuries to times when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was more permeable. Isabella looked at the pages with a mixture of fascination and terror. There was something in the symbols that made her vision blur, as if they were moving on the page. "I don't understand," she said. "Some families carry gifts, Isabella. The ability to see beyond the veil, to touch the other side, to serve as a bridge between worlds. Your mother had this gift, as did your grandmother before her, and we have reason to believe that you possess it too. But I never saw anything, never felt anything out of the ordinary." Lord Alistair laughed, a low, humorless sound. "The gift remains dormant until it is awakened, and for that, certain full conditions are necessary, certain stimuli. That is why you are here." The terror that had been merely a vague sensation now crystallized into pure panic. Isabella rose from the chair, backing toward the door. "You brought other girls here, others like me. What happened to them?" Lord Alistair's expression hardened. "You heard things you shouldn't have heard." "They died, didn't they? They all died because you tried to awaken something that shouldn't be awakened." "Some died," he said with a coldness that chilled Isabella's blood. "Others, let's say they found other destinies. The process is not without risks, I admit. But the potential benefits far outweigh the dangers. Benefits for whom?" Lord Alistair closed the book with an abrupt movement. "For those who understand the true power that resides between worlds, for those who know how to use such power for greater purposes." Isabella reached the door and turned the handle, but it didn't move. It was locked. The panic that had been growing in her chest now exploded into pure terror. "Let me out," she said, her voice rising an octave. "I'm afraid that's not possible," Lord Alistair said, walking around the desk toward her. "You've already seen too much, know too much, and there's still the question of determining whether or not you possess the gifts we seek. And if I don't possess them, if I'm just an ordinary girl, as you said..." The smile he gave her was the most terrifying she had ever seen. "Then, my dear, you will find that there are fates worse than death." The door opened behind her, and Isabella turned expecting to see Mrs. Albright. Instead, she found Gabriel. He was dressed entirely in black, from his boots to his shirt, as if in mourning. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something there, an emotion that could have been grief or remorse. "Gabriel," Lord Alistair said, his voice laden with approval, "you arrived at the right time. Miss Montgomery was about to learn the true reasons for her presence here." Gabriel entered the study and closed the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place was like a death sentence to Isabella's ears. "Father," Gabriel said, his voice strangely tense, "perhaps we should reconsider the approach. She is still very young, very what?" Lord Alistair turned to his son, his eyes gleaming with irritation. "Very innocent, very pure. Gabriel, you are allowing irrelevant feelings to interfere with the work." Isabella looked between the two men, seeing something she hadn't noticed before. There was tension there, a fundamental disagreement about something related to her. Gabriel seemed reluctant, almost protective, while his father radiated a cold determination. "Feelings are relevant," Gabriel said, taking a step forward. "If she truly is what we are looking for, then forcing the process too quickly can destroy exactly what we hope to preserve. And if we wait too long, she might try to escape, or worse, other people might find out about her." "Other people?" Gabriel turned to Isabella, and for the first time since he had entered the study, spoke directly to her. "You are not the only family with these abilities, Isabella. There are other lineages, other families that search for people like you, And not all of them have intentions as benevolent as ours. Benevolent? The word came out as a hysterical laugh. You brought me here under false pretenses. You keep me prisoner. You talk about awakening powers that could kill me. And you call that benevolent? Gabriel had the decency to look ashamed, but his father merely sighed with impatience. Youthful romanticism? Lord Alistair murmured. Gabriel, you forget that this is not a normal situation. This girl carries within her the potential for powers that could change the balance between life and death. This goes beyond personal considerations. Perhaps, Gabriel said, but his eyes remained fixed on Isabella. But if we destroy the vessel, what good is the content? Isabella felt like an object being discussed between collectors. There was a dehumanization in the way they spoke about her, as if she were merely a means to an end, not a person with her own desires and fears. I want to leave here, she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Now, Lord Alistair laughed. My dear, you don't understand. There is no escape. Not until we discover what you are capable of. And even after that, well, people with your gifts are too valuable to be left free in the world. You cannot keep me here against my will. In fact, a new voice said from the door, they can. Mrs. Albright had entered silently, carrying a tray with a steaming cup of tea. Her eyes gleamed with sadistic satisfaction as she placed the tray on a side table. The will that brought you here gives the Cavendishes complete legal guardianship over you until you turn 18, she continued. And there is also the matter that officially you died in a carriage that overturned on the way here. Very tragic. Your body was never found. The floor seemed to collapse beneath Isabella's feet. They had planned all this, weeks or perhaps months ago. Her arrival, her imprisonment, even the staging of her death. There was no one looking for her, no one who knew where she was. That's impossible, she whispered. Lord Alistair has a lot of influence, Mrs. Albright said with evident pleasure. Documents can be altered, witnesses can be persuaded. You will find that when one has enough power, very few things are truly impossible. Gabriel moved suddenly, placing himself between Isabella and the other two. Enough, he said, his voice laden with an authority Isabella hadn't heard before. Father, Mrs. Albright, you are frightening her unnecessarily. Frightening her? Lord Alistair raised an eyebrow. Gabriel, she needs to understand her situation. Understand what is at stake. She understands, doesn't she, Isabella? He turned to her, and his eyes carried a message she couldn't decipher. There was something there, a silent plea, or perhaps a warning. She nodded slowly, though she didn't know exactly what she was agreeing to. Very well, Lord Alistair said, looking unconvinced. Then we can proceed. Mrs. Albright, the tea? The governess picked up the cup from the tray and offered it to Isabella. The liquid was a strange, almost golden color, and exuded an aroma that made her head spin just from smelling it. What is this? She asked. Just something to help you relax, Lord Alistair said. The awakening process can be intense. It's best if you are in a receptive state of mind. Isabella looked at Gabriel, seeking some sign of whether or not she should accept the drink. But his face was carefully neutral, revealing nothing of his thoughts. What if I refuse? Then you will be forced to take it, Mrs. Albright said simply. One way or another, you will drink this. Isabella took the cup with trembling hands. The liquid was warm, and when she brought it to her lips, the aroma intensified, momentarily blurring her vision. There was something familiar about that smell, something that awakened memories she couldn't quite grasp. Slowly, Lord Alistair instructed. Let it enter your system gradually. The first sip was like swallowing liquid light that unfolded in infinite layers within her. The taste began sweet, reminiscent of wild honey gathered under full moons, but quickly transformed into something more complex. The bitterness of herbs that grew only in ancient cemeteries, the metallic taste of fear, the silky texture of whispered secrets. Each nuance shifted like waves breaking against invisible rocks on her tongue, and she could feel the liquid traversing her throat like warm mercury, spreading through her veins with its own purpose. Almost immediately, a subtle but profound transformation began to unfold in her perception. The colors in the study not only seemed more vibrant, they pulsed with a life of their own, as if each hue carried emotions she could almost touch. The red of the book spines whispered stories of lost passions. The gold of the picture frames sang laments of past glories, and the brown of the wood breathed memories of trees that had witnessed centuries of secrets. Sounds became a complex symphony she had never realized existed. The tick-tock of the clock was not just the marking of time, but the heart of the house itself beating in a melancholic rhythm. The crackle of the fireplace transformed into whispered conversations between flames that knew the secrets of everything they had consumed. Even silence had texture now, thick as velvet, laden with expectation, vibrating with potential. But it was through her skin that the most profound change manifested. Every pore had become a sensitive receptor, picking up currents that did not belong to the physical world. There was cold that did not come from the air, heat that did not emanate from the fireplace, and an electric tingling that coursed through her nerve endings as if someone were touching her soul with fingers of light. "Very good," Lord Alistair said, and his voice reached her through layers of reality, as if he were speaking from within a dream. "Now, I want you to concentrate, Isabella. Close your eyes and try to feel beyond what is physically present in this room." She obeyed, though every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee from that transformation that was undoing and remaking her from the inside out. The moment her eyelids closed, the world exploded in sensations that transcended anything she had ever experienced. With her eyes closed, she could hear not only the physical sounds, but the emotions that permeated them. The tick-tock of the clock carried the melancholy of decades of loneliness. The whisper of the wind through the windows brought echoes of tears shed in those gardens, of stifled screams in those corridors, of broken promises whispered in those very rooms. Each breath she took seemed to draw in not just air, but fragments of lives that had passed through those walls. And then the voices came. They began as distant whispers, as if coming from very far away, or from very long ago. Languages she didn't recognize, but which somehow penetrated directly into her understanding, bypassing the need for translation. They were voices of women crying for lost children, men lamenting betrayed loves, children calling for parents who would never return. Each voice carried not only words, but pure emotions, pain crystallized into sound, longing transformed into music, regret distilled into melody. As the voices became clearer, closer, Isabella began to feel presences around her, not through her eyes, but through a more primitive and profound perception. There was someone standing to her left, a feminine presence laden with sadness so intense it made her chest ache in sympathy. To her right, a masculine energy pulsed with contained rage, a fury that had been fed by decades of injustice. "You hear them, don't you?" Lord Alistair's voice seemed to come from a parallel dimension, filtered through veils of reality. The voices from the other side? She nodded, unable to speak, because her own voice seemed to have become part of that ghostly chorus. The voices were getting louder, more insistent, and with them came images that formed not behind her eyelids, but directly in her consciousness. Faces materialized in the darkness of her closed eyes. Pale faces marked by death. Eyes that shone with light that did not belong to the living. Smiles that carried as much love as despair. A golden-haired woman dressed in blue silk that had faded to the color of old tears. A man in a military coat whose chest was stained with blood that would never completely dry. A child of perhaps 8 years old, whose large, dark eyes seemed to contain all the lost innocence of the world. Each face that appeared brought with it a complete story, not told in words, but imprinted directly on her soul through pure and inescapable emotions. The woman in blue silk had died of a broken heart when her beloved left for a war from which he never returned. The military man had fallen in a duel of honor, defending a friend who had betrayed him. The child had been forgotten on a cruel winter night. Her small life extinguishing as she waited for parents who never returned for her. Each story unfolded within Isabella like poisonous flowers that bloomed in her chest, beautiful and terrible at the same time. She could feel their pains as if they were her own, their longings as echoes in her soul, their regrets as scars on her heart. "Open your eyes," Lord Alistair commanded, and his words cut through the visions like a cold blade. When she obeyed, the transition was like emerging from deep water to the surface. For a moment, she was disoriented, blinking against the light of the study that now seemed blinding. But gradually, her eyes adjusted, and then she saw that the world had changed forever. The study was no longer empty. Translucent figures filled every corner of the space, some clearly defined, others just suggestions of human form, as if made of mist and moonlight. They moved through the furniture, as if solid matter were just an illusion, walking in patterns that followed memories of when they were alive. The woman in blue silk stood beside the fireplace. A ghostly hand extended toward the warmth she could no longer feel. Her face was turned toward the window, eternally waiting for someone who would never return. The military man walked in precise circles near the bookshelf, his steps marking a rhythm that only he could hear, as if he were still marching to a battle that had ended decades ago. The child, sweet and terrible at the same time, sat on the floor near Lord Alistair's desk, playing with toys that existed only in her memory of death. Her lips moved in songs that made no sound. Her small hands held dolls made of air and longing. But there were other presences, too, less defined figures that hovered at the edges of her vision, shadows of people who had lost so much of themselves in death that only echoes of consciousness remained, fragments of soul that clung to existence through sheer willpower. They whispered constantly, a low murmur of words in dead languages, creating a soundtrack of lamentation that permeated everything. Isabella could see them all clearly now, as if her eyes had been recalibrated to a different frequency of reality. She could hear their individual voices within the collective chorus, distinguish their specific emotions within the symphony of pain. And even more terrifying, she could feel that they saw her too. Ghostly eyes turned in her direction, ethereal faces lit up with hope or curiosity or something darker. "The dead," she whispered, and her own voice sounded strange to her ears, as if it too had been touched by the transformation. "Oh, I can see them all. Not just the dead," Lord Alistair said, and there was triumph in his voice, a satisfaction that bordered on ecstasy. "Those who are trapped between worlds, those who cannot move on, who cling to the edge of life through unresolved emotions, unrequited loves, unfulfilled vengeances, you can see them, you can hear them, and if we properly develop your ability, you will be able to communicate with them, truly speak with the dead." The woman in blue silk turned from the window, her ghostly eyes meeting Isabella's through the veil between worlds. There was an intelligence there, a consciousness that recognized that finally, after so long, someone could see her. Slowly, gracefully, she approached, her bare feet making no sound on the carpet she couldn't touch. When she spoke, her voice was like wind through dry leaves, beautiful and melancholic and laden with decades of loneliness. "You can see me," she said, and there was so much relief in those words that Isabella's heart ached. "For so long, I walked invisible, screamed in silence, cried tears no one saw fall. But you see me?" Isabella extended her hand instinctively, moved by a compassion so profound it hurt. She wanted to touch, wanted to comfort, wanted to somehow alleviate the pain that emanated from the figure like the perfume of withered flowers. "Careful," Gabriel said, his voice urgent. "The first contact can be—" But it was too late. Isabella's fingers brushed the ethereal form of the woman, and at the moment of contact, the world exploded. "The dead," she whispered, and her own voice sounded strange to her ears. "Not just the dead," Lord Alistair said, and there was triumph in his voice. "Those who are trapped between worlds, those who cannot move on, you can see them, you can hear them, and if we properly develop your ability, you will be able to communicate with them." One of the figures, a woman in a white dress with hair that floated as if she were submerged, approached Isabella. Her eyes were wells of infinite sadness, and when she spoke, her voice echoed as if from a deep well. "Help us," the woman whispered. "Wow, we have been trapped for so long." Isabella instinctively reached out, wanting to touch, wanting to comfort. But the moment her fingers brushed the ethereal figure, a searing pain shot through her head. She screamed and recoiled, the teacup falling from her hands and shattering on the floor. "Too quickly?" Gabriel said, his voice laden with concern. "Father, you forced her too quickly. She is strong," Lord Alistair said, ignoring the tears of pain streaming down Isabella's face. "Stronger than any of the others. With the right training." "No," Isabella said, struggling to rise from the chair. "I don't want this. I don't want to see these things." But the figures were still there, clearer now, filling the study with their ghostly presences. Some seemed to be trying to communicate with her. Others just watched with empty eyes, and all radiated a sadness so profound that it made her heart ache. "It's not a matter of wanting," Lord Alistair said. "It's what you are. The gift is awakened now. There's no way to close it again." "There must be," Gabriel said, and Isabella could hear a note of desperation in his voice. "Father, look at her. She is suffering." "Temporary suffering for long-term gain," Lord Alistair said coldly. "Gabriel, you are being too sentimental." Isabella tried to concentrate on shutting out the visions, on making the figures disappear, but they seemed to be becoming more solid, not less. One of them, a man in a dark suit with a hole where his heart should have been, reached out to her, and this time she couldn't avoid the contact. The vision that hit her was like being struck by lightning. She saw the man's death, murdered by jealousy on a cold night decades ago, his blood soaking the earth of the manor gardens. She saw his soul trapped, unable to move on because of the hatred he carried. And she saw other deaths, other trapped souls, a cycle of violence and tragedy that had turned the manor into a repository of pain. When the vision passed, she was on the floor, Gabriel kneeling beside her, his hands holding her face. "Isabella," he said, his voice urgent. "Look at me. Focus on my voice." She obeyed, clinging to his gray-green eyes like an anchor in a storm. Gradually, the ghostly figures began to fade, though she could still feel them at the corners of her vision. "Fascinating," Lord Alistair said, making notes in a small book. "She not only sees the dead, but can experience their memories. That is rare, very rare." "Stop this," Gabriel said, his voice dangerously low. "She needs time to adjust." "Time is what we don't have," his father retorted. "Other families are looking for someone with these abilities. If we don't develop her potential quickly, then let them find her," Gabriel said, surprising everyone. "Perhaps it would be better for her." Lord Alistair stood abruptly, his face contorted with rage. "Gabriel, you forget our history. What they did to us, what they did to your mother. Do you really want to hand over a girl with these abilities to people who will use her until she is completely destroyed? And what are we doing differently?" The silence that followed was charged with tension. Isabella could feel the rage emanating from Lord Alistair like heat from a furnace, and something else, fear. He was afraid of something, or someone. "Your mother thought like you," Lord Alistair finally said. "She believed she could protect people like her from being used. And where did that lead her? She died trying to protect a girl who wasn't even her daughter." Gabriel slowly stood up, helping Isabella to sit in a chair. "My mother died because you forced her beyond her limits, because your ambition was more important than her life." "Your mother died because she was weak," Lord Alistair said, and the words fell into the room like blades. "But because when it was time to do what was necessary, she hesitated." Gabriel turned to his father, and Isabella could see muscles clenching in his jaw. "She died because she refused to sacrifice an innocent child for your experiments. And because of that refusal, we lost years of research, years that could have been used to perfect the process, to make it safer. Or you could have just stopped," Isabella said, her voice hoarse but firm. Both men turned to her, as if they had forgotten she was there. "Stopped?" Lord Alistair laughed bitterly. "My dear, you don't understand. What you can do, the abilities you possess, are just the beginning. With proper training, you could communicate freely with the dead. You could even bring them back for limited periods. Imagine the knowledge that could be obtained, the mysteries that could be solved. And imagine," Gabriel said, "how many lives could be destroyed in the process?" Lord Alistair turned to his son with an expression of disgust. You are allowing yourself to be influenced by inappropriate feelings. Gabriel, your attraction to this girl is clouding your judgment. Perhaps, Gabriel said, and he did not deny the accusation. But at least my humanity remains intact. The words hit Lord Alistair like slaps. For a moment, Isabella saw something akin to pain cross his face, before it was replaced by an even deeper coldness. "Very well," he said. "If you cannot do what is necessary, then I will do it alone. Mrs. Albright, take Miss Montgomery to the special quarters. We will begin intensive training in the morning." "No," Gabriel said, blocking the governess's path. "Father, I beg you, give her more time." "The time for choices has passed," Lord Alistair said. "Gabriel, get out of the way, or I will make you." For a moment, father and son stared at each other, and Isabella could feel the weight of years of conflict between them. There was love there, but also resentment, disappointment, and incompatible ambitions that had become an insurmountable chasm. Finally, Gabriel stepped aside. "I will not be a part of this," he said. "Not this time." "Then you are no longer welcome in this house," Lord Alistair said, and the words came out like a final sentence. Gabriel looked at Isabella one last time, and she saw so much sorrow in his eyes that her heart broke a little. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and then he left the study without looking back. Mrs. Albright gripped Isabella's arm with painful force. "Come," she said, "your new quarters are waiting." As she was dragged out of the study, Isabella looked over her shoulder at Lord Alistair. He stood before the window, his hands clasped behind his back, watching something in the gardens that she couldn't see. There was a loneliness in him that was almost palpable, the loneliness of a man who had sacrificed everything, including family, for an obsession that consumed him. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts us most is what makes us most human.